What are we whispering about? Hello everyone, I'm Claire Casey, as many of you know, and I've put this talk together for you about pixies and their haunts. And this is something that I am passionate about, that I've been researching for quite a few years now, but yeah, started about 2016, but more in a more focused way since 2020, since the end of lockdown. Well, that's when I started going to these places. So a bit about me first. I'm an artist. I'm a writer. I have a podcast called Faery Whispering. I live in Newton Abbot in Devon, which is South Devon, with my two children, teenagers now. So single parent. I've had many different career paths, always come back to art, always come back to nature, and supernatural. When I was growing up as a child in Devon, my paternal grandfather, both my paternal grandparents grew up in Princetown on Dartmoor. So they had connections with Dartmoor. My paternal grandfather encouraged my interest in the supernatural. He bought me a series of Usborne books, which I think a few of us had as children, especially growing up in the 1970s, early 80s. And with my parents, we go out on Dartmoor quite regularly for picnics when family visited, or just as family trips out to have a picnic and a wander. Then when I went to primary school, I had a really lovely teacher when I was about 9, who was an artist as well. And he taught us about the folklore on Dartmoor. And from then, I just became fascinated by these stories. And my parents bought Theo Brown's book about Dartmoor folklore. I also had a copy, they also had a copy of Ruth St. Ledger Gordon's book about the folklore and witchcraft of Dartmoor, and I was absolutely intrigued by those stories. And also, my fairy connection started from an early age. I just sensed that there was something else in nature. There was something, there's another dimension. I certainly believed in the other world, and I was very sensitive to it. I still am. I consider myself as an empath, and gradually built my sensitivity through the work that I do now, really since my 20s, I suppose, when I started to be interested in seeing fairies. I had an experience where I saw a fairy when I was at university, and substances were involved on that occasion. Did a lot of experimentation, and I've had a night out. That was my cat, by the way. She always appears when I'm recording videos. Demands my attention, so I might have to pause and let her out in a moment. Yeah, so anyway, I'd been out for a night with some friends at university. We'd been to a club. I'd experimented with some mind-altering substances, and I was in bed, laying in bed, and beside my bed there was a rubber plant. And I looked over and I could see this little person sat on one of the leaves of the plant. So that's my cat. I'm just going to pause it here and let the cat out, and then I'll finish the story. Okay, where was I? I was talking about my experience at university. Yeah, so I looked across at my rubber plant, and there was this little being in amongst the leaves. He was actually, I think he's actually sort of sat on the stalk of the rubber plant, as far as I remember. I don't have a rubber plant in front of me, so I can't. But I think they have these little stalks before they get to the leaf, and he was sort of sat in next to the main stem of the plant and peering out at me, and seemed curious that I could see him. And I would describe that he looks to me like a typical elf. At that time, it's not something that I'd researched or anything. It's just I felt that he that's how he looked. He's quite slim, size. I mean, he would have been quite small, not tiny, but maybe about 6 inches tall. But he was sort of sat down with his knees up, looking across at me through out the shadows, and didn't really have much of an expression, just looked curious. So I was kind of looking at him, and he was looking at me, and it wasn't something that went on for ages. I mean, when those sorts you see those sort of things, it seems to go on for ages because it's so amazing, and you can't believe it. But I didn't feel frightened. I just felt really curious with what I was seeing, and then I think I just turned over and went back to sleep. I don't remember. I think 'cause it was so quick, I didn't really have time to think about what I was going to do. I was just enthralled by seeing this, and then I don't remember how whether he disappeared. I just remember seeing him and then turning over and going back to sleep. And I did draw him actually when I got back from university. After I'd finished university, I came back so I was in Swansea, and there were lots of stories about fairies on the Gower Peninsula. And I'd met people that had seen lights on the Gower Peninsula, had strange experiences, or spoken about fairies. So that was my first visual experience of seeing one. And then after university, I mean, whilst I was in Swansea, I really, really, really missed Devon and Dartmoor, especially. I just had a yearning for it. And even though there's the Gower Peninsula is very beautiful and sort of similar in some ways to Dartmoor landscape, it just wasn't home. And so as soon as I got home after university, I spent a lot of time reconnecting with Devon, with where I grew up, and going up onto Dartmoor. And I did loads and loads and loads of drawings of fairies. They just poured out of me. I just didn't know where it's coming from. I was just drawing all these little fairy beings. And they weren't like your typical fairies. And then they weren't like, the Tinkerbell type fairies. They were quite unusual little creatures that I was drawing. And then a friend, it's actually my stepmother at the time, showed me a book of Brian Froud's art, and I really related to the way that he portrayed fairies. It was his book, Faeries. And yeah, and then I just felt like, that's how I have experienced them. This little figure that I'd seen, that's how I relate to them through his imagery. And so, yeah, I always see them as being part of nature. So this is one of my paintings behind me here, and it's of fairies, pixies, as we call them in the southwest, in Wistman's Wood, which is a mysterious woodland up on Dartmoor, which I love. I've been to several times. I try and go once a year if I can. So I'll start the presentation. The presentation starts with a reading of a poem called Piskies by a poet called T.P. Cameron Wilson, who was born about 1888 and he died in 1918 in the First World War. So I'll start with that. I will be sharing, I'll give you an outline of what I'm going to be talking about. Towards the end, I'm going to be sharing some more modern Pixie sightings, mostly my own, but I'll talk about some sources of other ones from historical sources. There's some information about Theodore Percival Cameron Wilson. This poem was published after his death in 1919, and he was a school teacher, and I really feel that he was very much in touch with his inner child. This poem's very, I find it very moving, this poem. Every time I read it and listen to it, I read the words, there's something about it. This idea of how Dartmoor can lift your spirits, and it's written in the Devon dialect.
There be piskies up to Dartmoor, and tin good, you say they're baint. I've felt 'em groping up my heart, I've heard their voices calling faint. I've knowed a man be crooked down, his soul fair stocked and heavy like, climb up to broken saddle tor, and bear his head for winds to strike. And all the girt black murky griefs, and all the pain and fog and grime, have blowed away and left 'em clear, like busbush fires in swailing time. And what med do so brave a thing as thick white spells to tack and weave, but little Piskie's bitty hands, or God himself has give 'em leave. But tidden him would stop and spy from Widdicombe to Cranmere Pull, to amaze the scheming little heart of every Jacky lantern full. For maybe 'tis a lonesome rod, or heather blues, or peaty ling, or nobbut just a rainy coombe, the spell that mecks and teck and sing. And this I know, the little tots be ever calling silver faint. There be piskies up to Dartmoor, and tin good, you say they're baint.
People do, going up onto Dartmoor instantly lifts me up, lifts my spirits. I think it's psychological with being in a high place, but it's also the energy of the place, which I will talk about a bit later. So yeah, I've already introduced myself, being an artist, and there's some of my art in this, and in this presentation. There's me out for a walk on Dartmoor. Sometimes when I can, I go out into nature and paint as well. So The contents, I'll give you a brief intro to the Pixies, just very brief because you could probably do a whole talk about who the Pixies are. um, and then we'll look at some Pixie haunts on Dartmoor and my adventures to find these Pixie haunts, which I've been actively doing, like I said, since about 2020. Literally during lockdown, I just thought I'd started researching Pixies and I thought I've got to get out there and visit these places. And then, as I said, I'll talk about some modern day sightings at the end, and there won't be any questions and answers, obviously, because this is a recording. But if you've got any questions, then you can send them to me, and I will do my best to answer them. I always love hearing from people. And I'll give my contact details at the end as well, but you can contact me at claire@faerywhisperer.co.uk, and that's Faery for fairy. For all those, so this talk is for all those who wander and wonder what is on the other side of the hill. So if you have that curiosity, this is for you. Always keep that sense of wonder. Who are the Pixies? Well, it's the name for the fairies in the southwest of England, up as far as the New Forest. I learnt recently there's stories about pixies in the New Forest. Other names they're known by, or other versions of Pixie is Pixie, Pucky, and Pixie, Pixie, was popularised by Mrs. Bray. And I've said more at the end there, but I won't be talking about her in depth for this talk. That can be a whole separate talk about Pixie folklorists, which, yeah, I'll save for another time. Pixie is also found in Yorkshire at Greenhow Hill and the word was brought there by the Cornish miners who worked there. And there are various ideas about where the name and beliefs about pixies come from. Quite numerous. I don't have time to go in all again. That needs to be a whole other talk in itself about pixies and where they come from. These ideas about who they are. So just briefly, some of these ideas about their origins are that they're an ancient race of small people that, so they actually existed and they were little people that were running around Dartmoor and other places in the southwest. They're a cultural memory of the Celtic people, whoever they were. I know that's quite a broad term, Celtic, but people of that time, or even Neolithic people. They are a reinvention of the old nature gods of springs, wells, hills, and other places in the landscape. I think they've always been there. I think, these spirits, they are the same spirits that were there, that people were worshipping thousands of years ago. We've just given them different names. That they're the souls of unbaptized children. That comes more from a kind of a religious viewpoint. That they're beings that exist but live in another dimension of time and space. That's what I feel is that they are. They're here around us, but we just can't see them because they're in that other dimension. And occasionally that veil thins, and for whatever reason, it could be to do with our perception. I think it's mostly to do with our perception, where we are, whether we're tuned in, whether we're noticing, whether we're in a receptive, meditative state. Also, it's to do with the place and the energies of the place, perhaps the magnetic anomalies in that place. The yeah, the environment has a big play in this, and all of those things, our receptivity and the nature of the place, um, are conducive to us having these experiences. What do they look like? There's some of my paintings of pixies. So it depends which source you read. In folklore, they're variously described as a bundle of rags, old wizened and squint-eyed. They could be male or female, and their size is small. Um, they're described as being sometimes between 12 to 18 inches in height, up to 3 foot tall. I've read one account where somebody saw them and it was like a human-sized figure, or more our sort of height. Green, red, blue, fairy uniform, or nature colours, ragged or naked. And they're shapeshifters, so they can change into animals such as rabbits. They can appear as hares and hedgehogs. Hedgehogs were often believed to be pixies that stole milk from cows in fields, or they'll appear as will-o'-the-wisp, which is a more common way that people have seen them or experienced them as lights. So balls of light near marshy places. And I spoke to somebody on my podcast who had seen many will-o'-the-wisp lights in marshy places on Dartmoor in his time on the moor. And he'd actually captured photos of them. And as I said, I'll speak about some modern day sightings of pixies at the end. One thing that all folklorists agree on is that pixies are tricksy and they like to play tricks and practical jokes on people, and they range from being quite mild, annoying tricks to quite dangerous and malicious tricks. So, for example, knocking pans off the stove, curdling the butter, kissing maidens on the cheek. Yes, they're cheeky, blowing out candles, making noises in wells. Most common one is Miss Pixie leading people. So that would be an experience where people know a place. For example, they've walked an area of Dartmoor somewhere many times, but they end up losing their way. Usually mist is involved in these stories, so the mist comes down and totally lose their direction. I've seen that on Dartmoor. I've been on Dartmoor when the mist has come down, and luckily in those instances, I've not been far from my car. I've known, where I'm going, but you can't see anything when the mist comes down on Dartmoor, so it's quite a dangerous situation to be in. It's wet and cold as well. One of the remedies against being pixie-led is to turn your pockets inside out, and that's meant to. The idea behind that is that it's supposed to confuse the pixies because they don't recognize you anymore because you've changed your appearance. And they find the results of their tricks very funny, and that's where the saying to laugh like a pixie comes from. There's many thresholds, places where our worlds meet with the pixies. I'm just gonna stop sharing there, pause. I'm just going to share my screen again. Go back to where I was. Resume slideshow. Right. Threshold. So there's many places where our world and the Pixies' worlds converge. And that's because we have created our places, we've infringed on their places. So it's us infringing on them, really. There are gardens. There's a beautiful garden on Dartmoor called Heathercombe that's open every summer that I go to. That's the top left. Talk a bit more about gardens in a moment. There's markets, there's several stories about pixies frequenting markets. One of the most well-known ones is about the pixie midwife, where she she helps a pixie couple to deliver. She delivers their baby, and then she takes some of the magic ointment and puts it on one of her eyes, and she sees them for who they really are, that they're really pixies. And then she's at the market and she sees the husband in the market stealing an apple from one of the stalls, and she says his name, and he says, oh, he's surprised to see her, and asks her which eye she can see him through, and she points to her eye, whichever eye it was, and he blinds her in that eye in retribution for her being able to, for spying basically on the pixies. That's one of the things that they are against. Is a big no-no with pixies, is spying on them. So that's one of the more malicious sides of that pixies are said to have in causing illness or blindness or illness to people or to the cattle if you anger them. Bottom left is Dockwell Farmhouse, where one of the folklore stories I'm going to share later is based, a story called Nanny Norrish. And bottom right, this is Emsworthy, where there's a ruined farm, and this barn is called the Red Barn, and photographers love it. Every spring when the bluebells come up, there are loads of photographers around this barn photographing it with the bluebells. It's also quite a spooky barn. I've had some strange experiences there. I did a podcast episode with Joe Hickey Hall in June 2022, so last year. And we were sat on one of the old walls near this barn talking. And then I played back the audio later when I was editing it for the episode, and I could hear a woman singing behind us in the background. I then interviewed Kate Hairgirl Ray for an interview for a podcast episode. So I did about orbs, and she tuned into the barn and said, well, she thought there was quite dark energy there, which I'd agree with. And she suggested, and she tuned into the woman, that maybe this was a protective spirit for me, that was there protecting me from this darker energy. They're really interesting. Both those episodes. The one with Joe, I'm about to re-release this summer on my Faery Whispering podcast, because I recorded it originally for Weird Wonderful Wonders. But the one with Kate is on my YouTube channel, and I re-released it on my Faery Whispering podcast in the last couple of months. So I wanted to talk about, don't dwell too much on threshold places, but because again, that's something I'm writing about in detail in my book, and I could probably do another talk just all about these in-between places. So gardens, again, there's Heathercombe Garden, top left, that's my son at Heathercombe Garden, and in the middle as well, that's my son and daughter at Heathercombe Garden by one of the beautiful ponds there. Lustley Orchard, there's a fairy door that's in the foot of one of the trees. It's completely natural, but it appeared in a dream that I had, and I'd never seen this door before, but I had a dream about going through a fairy door in the bottom of a tree, and then literally the same day, the morning after, we went to Lustley Orchard, and I found this door. There's a few other things that happened that I actually shared on the podcast episode I did with Joe Hickey Hall, the Modern Fairy Sightings, where I spoke about that experience. There's another picture of Lustley Orchard there, and this is Chalacombe Meadow. Very beautiful meadows in Dartmoor that are open every spring. Actually, they're open. There's footpaths through the meadows. They belong to Chalacombe Farm, but there's public footpath through, and again, it's another beautiful place for bluebells. So, in folklore, gardens, orchards, and meadows quite often appear, especially orchards, especially in more of the Cornish Pixie folklore. So William Bottrell and Ennis Tregarthen write about fairy happenings in orchards. And what usually happens is that, for example, there's a story where a gentleman goes up onto part of Bodmin Moor. I think it's Bodmin Moor in Cornwall, and or anyway, no, Selina Moor. Yes, and he finds a little hut hidden, a bothy. Oh no, sorry. No, start again. That's later in the story. I should have my notes in front of me. Sorry. So he is drawn to this place on the moors, and he goes through all these bushes, and he finds he's walking into an orchard with all this tempting fruit hanging down. So he's coming into this garden, and then he's in this orchard, and in the orchard, there's a woman that he recognizes, Grace, she's called. I think she's called Grace Hutchins. He's called Mr. Noy. And the strange thing is that she died a year earlier. So he's very surprised to see her. And she says, well, I'm here with the fairies, with the pixies. And basically she's there working for them as a kind of a servant to the pixies. And she warns him, don't eat any of the fruit, don't drink anything here, because there's a party going on. They're all drinking cider and having a great time, singing and dancing. And he can see, he's looking through the orchard, and he can see the pixies dancing and frolicking in the meadow. So the meadow then is like this, almost represents this Elysian place. It goes back to ancient times. The Egyptians believed that the human soul passed on to a heavenly meadow when we died, and the Greeks believed in these Elysian fields, meadows, where the virtuous went and the great and the good. went to after death. So it kind of, this idea, it's a very ancient idea about orchards, meadows, gardens being these gateways to the other world. And there's certainly some gardens like Heathercombe and beautiful Lusty Orchard and the meadows at Chalacombe, where you can quite believe, you can feel that you're in a very special place. So protections and offerings, there's various protections that people used to keep the fairies happy or out of their homes. So offerings included pins, because they're cheap and easy to find. So pins, a piece of cloth would be something that you take with a pin to a pixie place, for example, a pixie's cave up at Sheepstall, a bowl of water or milk, coins, money trees. There's a few of those up on Dartmoor near waterfalls. There's some at Becky Falls, there's some at Lidford Gorge near the waterfalls there. And when I went up to Scotland last year, I was really amazed, pleasantly surprised to see one of these money trees. It's like a big money log that's by the waterfall at the Faery Falls, which is in a place called Rose Marquee. And Robert Ogilvie Crombie wrote about the Faery Falls, and he'd experienced elves there. Where was I? So money trees, Pixies Cross. This is on a golf course outside of Tavistock. Other protections against pixies include horseshoes on doors, iron horseshoes, because iron is believed to be a protection against fairies, or certain types of wood, for example, rowan hung over a doorway. Rowan's believed to be a protective type of wood, as is hazel. So hazel was often used to make babies' cradles. It's a way of warding off pixies as well. Another offering, more modern day offering, would be a song or a few words, or to touch the ground. Basically, leave no trace. If I take anything physical, it would be to pick up something from the place on my walk there. So a fallen leaf, a twig, a nice unusual stone, that kind of thing. Certainly nothing that's not biodegradable or natural. So pixie haunts. These are the places that are associated with pixies in folklore, superstition, and custom. According to, so their preferred habitats are being close to water, on riverbanks, pools, waterfalls, rocky places. There's several tools that are associated with pixies, and there's rocks that are named after pixies, for example, the Puggy Stone. Hills and hill forts, they like to be up high so that they can survey the landscape. Woodland, which offers plenty of places to hide, and ferny combes. So a combe is like a little valley, and they like those sorts of places for their merrymaking and singing and dancing. There's many places with pixie or pixies in the name on Dartmoor, or other derivations of pixie, like the Puggy Stone. That's just a few of them. And that's my little pixie there in amongst the ferns. I think that's in Wistman's Wood a few years ago. It's my son, Ethan. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my process of which I call Faery Whispering, and that's the name of my podcast as well. So this is my process for visiting a fairy place and connecting with it. So it's very mindful. I don't just say, point at a map and say, okay, that's a place that's associated with fairies. I'll drive there and walk there and go and see it and come home and take a few pictures kind of thing. It's more of a embodied experience. Obviously thoughtful and respectful of the beings in that place. So I like to do all the practical research, looking at the folklore, the maps. I use my intuition about when and where to visit. I'm always making an intention that I'm going to connect with the fairies and what I want to offer, what I want to know, all those sorts of things. So it makes it a more magical process. I like to envision the place and connect with it that way as well, connect with it energetically before I go. And then when I'm walking to the place, walk mindfully and with intention, engage all my senses. I'm trained in natural mindfulness. So it's about, what you feel, hear, taste, all of those senses are engaged. Arriving at the place, asking permission and listening to intuitive response. Gifting. So something non-physical, as I was just talking about. For example, a song, a few words, touching the ground, something natural collected on the way. I'll do some meditation there, drawing, journaling, using all my senses to engage. Sometimes I usually do take my dowsing crystal or dowsing rods, and that's another way to connect as well. And leaving the place, always give thanks. And at home, journaling about it, sketching from photos, sharing with others. But if it's a place that you want to keep private, you feel should be kept private, then do that. There's some places that, especially on Dartmoor, that lots of people frequent, but I don't know how many people really engage with the place. For example, Houndtor, which is one of my favourite places. The two photos here are of Houndtor, and that is a really special place. I really feel like it's some kind of energetic labyrinth in some ways. And there's some wonderful rock formations like this one that, to me, that's like a being poking out. I've been there at sunrise as well, and at sunset. It's an incredible place, and I think there's so much more to these places than meets the eye. That the ancient people, there's a wonderful book called Dartmoor Mindscapes by my friend Peter Knight, who gives wonderful tours of these places, and he helps you to connect with how the ancient people would have seen these places. So that's really opened my eyes as well. So I creatively respond to the place because I'm an artist, and one of the ways I do that is by noticing simulacra. So that's an image or representation of someone or something. And I usually see these in rocks, trees, the land, water sometimes. I see faces and figures and symbols and doorways. Sometimes, or most of the time, I'll see half an image. So I'll think, oh, that looks like half a face. And I'll photograph it and mirror it. I've created hundreds of these images since I started doing this about Was it 2018? So yeah, about 5 or 6 years. Every time what I see is only a fraction of incredible imagery. So I might photograph part of something and then I mirror it, and it's amazing what unfolds in that image. I create art in response to a place, so the beings I see in the natural forms I draw in place or from my photos. I journal about what I experience. I've created quite a few fairy journals over the years where it's just a hardback A4 book I've filled with notes about my journeys and experiences in this place, and that's what's going into my books and gradually disseminating through every which way I can. My more coming on my podcast soon about pixies and fairy experiences. Yeah, so I journal about what I experiences, and sometimes by doing that, more wisdom comes through, which I attribute to the fairies and the land. For example, take time to smell the roses. So even with engaging with the plants in my garden, like my rose bush, I receive that message. I feel a connection with roses. I've had connections with rose fairies on and off. I think it's just what we give our attention to. So if we give our attention to a certain plant, then or feel that we need to give attention to a certain plant or tree, then that information will start to flow between us. That's just a mirror photo for fun I did of me a few years ago. Why are places associated with pixies and the supernatural? So people generally, these places evoke an emotional response. And it's only by going to these places that you can understand what that emotional response might be. So I've been to places sometimes and I've just felt very calm and very relaxed. Other places I felt really elated. Sometimes I've been to places and they've helped me to release emotions. So perhaps I've had something on my mind and I felt sad or worried and I've cried. And it's because of that place, it's helped me to release that emotion. So there's a whole varying emotional response that we can have to a particular place. And then over time, perhaps they become known as places associated with certain things. So you go to this place and there are spirits there that make you feel happy, or there are spirits there that aren't very nice and make you feel bad, or, so that I think emotion's a big part of it. Topographical features. So, for example, there's tools, ferny combs, woodland pools, rocks, mines. All of them have a different feeling to them. Tools can have different I was just talking about simulacra. Perhaps people recognize faces in them, or shapes, or beings. Antiquities. So in the past, there's lots of superstition and misunderstandings about purpose of these places until until archaeologists came along and historians and started to really analyze what these places could be. I don't think anybody still really knows exactly what some of these places were used for. So there's still some mystery about these places that lends to the sense of perhaps foreboding or the unknown. A lot of these places are mentioned in folklore stories associated with the supernatural, and then some of those stories are based on experiences people have had. They're not just generic folklore. And coming up to more recent times, perhaps any of us could have a personal experience in that place, or have a friend that's had a personal experience in that place, and then it becomes part of more modern folklore. So let's move on to some of the places. One of the places I wanted to find a couple of years ago, was it last? No, it's last year, wasn't it? February 2022, was the Pixie's door. And this I found out about through a wonderful website called Dartifacts that actually lists all of the Pixie places on Dartmoor and gives you the OS reference, how to find them. It's not an easy place to get to, and the first time I tried to find it, I just gave up because it was just, there's lots of big areas of marsh. I couldn't find the right way to get there. So then I shared on Facebook, one of the Facebook groups. I was hoping to get there, and somebody very helpfully gave me a route. It's a doorway, it's a stone on the side of Kennan Hill that looks like a little door. There's another stone below it. I do have a video that I created about this whole journey, which includes the feelings I was having on the way, because I think it's really important. I can show you these photos, but it's important to really sense into what the experience was like of walking to this place, because it wasn't an easy place to get to. I was noticing lots of things on the way. A parlour, excuse me, a parlour is a place traditionally that we would receive guests into our homes. So we could look at these places as meeting places between humans and the spirits of the land. The parlour here on Cannon Hill, which is below the Pixie's door, I don't have a photo of it here. There is one in the video that I created. It's just a depression in the ground. It's like a little semicircular depression in the side of the hill. There are some strange stones around the outside, no particular configuration, but they obviously, to me, I felt they were part of that place. There's another Pixie's parlour at Sandy Park, which is near Drew Stainton. And that is completely different. It's a pile of rocks, but it's not just, it looks like it's been constructed. People, I expect more conventional archaeologists would say that's a natural structure, but it's the fact that it's right at the edge of a field. Excuse me, I just have it's right at the edge of the field, and it's piled up like a cromlech, a giant cromlech. I don't have a picture of it here because it is on private land, and I was asked not to share it on social media, but it's amazing. Maybe I'll draw it. I'll do a drawing of it for my book. Okay, so I was going to show you a video here of the first part of the walk up to Pixie's door. I'm stood in warm February sunshine, listening to birdsong on an old track that leads up a hill called Button Hill. I'm on a quest to find a place called the Pixie's Door. The track I'm walking on is lots of big boulders and smaller stones. So it's obviously used as some kind of cart track in times gone by.
ancient place, lots of ancient ruins up on the hills here. Ooh, sounds like a helicopter. So I'm going to see what I find. There's some really beautiful, very old holly trees lining the wall along the edges of Ensworthy House that have become part of the walls, and they look like goddesses with all the lumps and bumps and lines, feminine forms, real incredible old wise souls. And rising higher to the gateway that's ahead of me, I'm going to have a look through the gateway. Fantastic view across to Chagford with the hills above Chagford and some smoke rising from Chagford. Must be a bonfire. Very gentle sky today, full of light fluffy clouds, golden light, blue, very pale blue. And the track leads on, taking me uphill. There's a lovely old rowan tree that's also very feminine looking. Goddess of them all. There's very female, feminine energy to Dartmoor. And this gentle light today feels even softer and more feminine. But its wildness and its harshness can be the other side of feminine as well, that very wild, dangerous, passionate feminine. There's a heart stone there. It's a stone that's heart-shaped. Love it when I spot those.
Another famous pixie place, well-known pixie place on Dartmoor, that isn't easy to find though, is the Pixies Cave at Sheepstall, and that was mentioned by Polwheel in, now I don't know if I got that date right, 17th century. I think it's probably the 1700s, so the 18th century. I need to check that date. And he said that the villagers of Sheepstall heard the Pixies pounding their apples and grinding their corn. So there's sound associated with this place, which is really interesting because there are many places on Dartmoor and in Cornwall actually that are where pixies are associated with sounds. So, for example, there's some mines near Hennock, which is the other side of Dartmoor. It's one of the villages in the Team Valley. And the villagers said that they could hear pixies singing from the mines. There's other places that have sounds in Cornwall, the mines, the miners said that they could hear knocking, so that the pixies down there are called the knockers, the pixies of the mines. Singing and lights have been seen in meadows, for example, on the edge of Chagford, and coming from the ancient settlements around Chagford as well. So it's interesting, this sound connection with pixies. I've experienced hearing singing, which I'll talk about later on when I talk about my experiences of the fairies. William Crossing, who is a very well known topographer of Dartmoor, author of all things Dartmoor. Later in life, he expressed in a newspaper article that he had had a childhood experience that he believed was seeing a pixie. And this was at the Pixies Cave on Sheepstall. So he would have been about 5 or 6 at the time. And he walked up to, he was really excited about going to the Pixies Cave, and he had his little scrap of fabric. He had his pins with him to gift to the Pixies, and he was with his, essentially it would have been his nursemaid, Anne, and they were walking up towards the cave, and as they were approaching, William saw something flit out of the cave, and he immediately knew, for him, this was a pixie. He told Anne about his caretaker, about what he'd seen, and she, typical adult style, dismissed it and said, "Oh, it must have been a rabbit." However, William said that I've forgotten how he termed it, but he said he felt it could have been a pixie. Even later in life, that's what he felt. I think we need to trust our feelings about these things. And if we see something and feel in our heart that's what we've seen, then to trust it. I think that's wonderful that he offered that little insight into him as a child and that experience, because he'd written in 1890, he wrote the Tales of the Dartmoor Pixies, which is a beautiful little book. It's not very long, but it's packed full of pixie folklore. And I'm sure that that must have been inspired in him by this experience. Why else would he take such an interest in pixies, especially as he was quite dismissive of them actually still being on Dartmoor? So he was a rationalist. It was very, a time of industry and scientific breakthroughs, and this idea of the other world was being discouraged, and gradually many people were moving away from that idea. But the fact that he then later on, I think it's around 1920-ish, wrote this newspaper article that included this little glimpse into his childhood and having this possible sighting, just makes me wonder whether he was starting to reclaim some of that wonder later in life. Oh, yes. So I was going to say about what happened while I was there. When I went there to the cave and I arrived, and there's a grandfather there with his 2 children. And these children, I think they're about 4 and 5, only little, and they were running in and out of the cave. And he had lost his mobile phone. And I said to him, in all seriousness, I said, "Did you bring something for the Pixies?" And he said, "No." And I said, "Oh." I said, "Well, the custom is to bring something for the Pixies before you go into the cave." I rang his phone for him. We didn't find it. So he left without his phone. I brought a little gift for them. I couldn't get in the cave. It was a bit too scary for me to try and get in there backwards because I didn't know what I was going into. So, but I found it impossible to get in there. So I took some photographs inside the cave, and then I noticed right at the back this little shadow. Can you see that? I thought, oh my gosh, that looks like a pixie with a hat. It's probably the shadow of one of the rocks, but then I thought, that's an unusual shadow. It looks like a little person that's sort of lurking behind the rock. There's lots of, well, not lots, there's a few wells and springs on Dartmoor that are associated with pixies, and there's a few more in Cornwall and other places in the southwest. So I went to Feakswell near Princetown back in about September 2022 with my dad, and it's another place I wanted to find. It was built in 1568 by, or financed by, Sir John Fitz. I can't imagine that he would be actually building the well himself, but he had the well built, or the well enclosure. So it's a natural spring. And the story is that he and his wife were riding up on Dartmoor. The mist came down. They got horribly lost, and they followed a stream to its source, this spring, and they were able to quench their thirst. And from thanks, because they believed that they'd been pixie led, so they gave thanks to the spirit of the spring by building this well enclosure. Also, the Reverend Sabine Baring-Gould, who's also a folklorist, he recorded some pixie stories too. In the 19th century, he also got lost there with a group of Ordnance Survey officers. The mist came down, and they didn't have their OS maps with them. They were lost too. A bronze rapier was found near the well, dating from 12,000 to 900 BC. So does that show that it was a place of offering from that time? Also, oak root bowls were found along the Blackabrook stream near to the well. And nearby is Merivale, which is only 1.5 miles away, which is a huge ceremonial landscape. So I feel that this must have been linked to Merivale in some way. Other wells, there's a Fitz's well near Oakhampton, which is connected to Sir John Fitz as well. So Fitz is another interpretation of Fitz. There's a Pixie well at Fernworthy, which is covered over by the reservoir now. And the last photo down here, that's a picture of it when it last appeared, when there was drought. So I think it came up again this last summer, just gone, a very hot summer we just had, and a lot of the antiquities that are beneath Fernworthy Reservoir showed again. It's called the Pixie Well. And Fernworthy has a story about gnomes taking vengeance. So hundreds of years ago, the story goes, a farmer wanted to build a new home in the area, and he found a lovely granite outcrop that he took stone from. Unfortunately, it was the home to some gnomes. They weren't happy, and in revenge, they stole the couple's child, and they never returned the child, sadly for the couple. In 1938, the building began off the reservoir, and a huge storm flooded the construction site. And again, that was blamed on the unhappy gnomes. So come on to Bellevator, Tom White and the Pixies. And I took this walk on Earth Day in April 2021. I started at Hexworthy Bridge, which is near Huckabee Farm, where one of the characters from the story, Tom White and the Pixies, was supposed to have lived. So this Tom White lived in Postbridge. His girlfriend lived on Huckabee Farm. We don't know her name in the story, but I've called her Lizzie. He would visit Lizzie every day and walk the 5 miles each way from Postbridge to Huckabee Farm. One evening, he was returning across the moor later than usual, and as he passed Bellevator, he stumbled upon a group of pixies dancing, singing and celebrating, and they grabbed him and pulled him into their dance, and they didn't let him go until sunrise. Poor Tom who was terrified by his encounter, had to struggle back to Postbridge in time to start work the next day without a night's sleep. And he was so terrified he never visited Lizzie again. She was okay then. She was a very pretty woman, and she had lots of other suitors. But poor Tom never saw her again. Yeah, so I walked from Huckabee Bridge up to Bellevator, past Laughter Man. On the way up to the Tor, I found this piece of pony tail or mane, and to me it looked like it had been plaited. And I felt that it was a gift from the Pixies, because they are said to plait the manes and tails of ponies. It's a picture of my children walking up to Bellevator on another day. We went up there for Mother's Day a couple of years ago. Beautiful sunrise over the moors, and this is Tom on the cover of William Crossing's Dartmoor, Tales of the Dartmoor Pixies, surrounded by the Pixies. So as I said, I like to notice things in nature, images, faces. And when I was up on Bellevar, I saw this lovely mossy patch, and I thought, oh, that looks like a little pixie holding a basket of flowers. So I decided to draw a pixie. Okay, so it's time for Pixie's Door Part 2. I found the Pixie's door, which is really exciting, seeing it gleaming on the hillside. And I'm sat against it at the moment, my back against the biggest rock anyway that stands out, that's very flat. I cleared a bit of the bracken away from the edges so I could see the shape. And then below it there's another rock, just literally about 3 feet down, which is more of a arched, like a Gothic arch shaped stone. So maybe they're both doorways, but this certainly feels like a visioning place. So I'm sat here with my back against this rock. I'm looking out to the top of Button Hill. That's Button. And the rocks on top of that, all along that ridgeway. And then to my right is Kestor, which I can see very clearly from here. It's direct line of sight as I turn my head to the right. guess that must be Fernworthy over there. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at the map to check. But obviously there's the Teen Valley over there. And over to my left, I'm looking out towards, I suppose it's Oakhampton Way and the A30, which I can't see, but I know it's over in that direction. And Cosden Hill, which I could definitely see more clearly if it wasn't for the bracken. Just sit forward. I think that's Cosden there, and then down to South Seal and South Dalton and all of those places. It feels like a very special place, and I'm here. It's just gone midday. I'm drinking some fairy tea, which is a type of oolong tea that I ordered online a while ago. So I'm going to sit here and dream. I think it feels like a dreaming place. Below me is Pixie's parlour, which is like a depression in the ground, kind of a little semicircular enclosure enclosed by, it's just a dip really in the ground, but it's very green and lots of grasses, and there's a couple of little rocks in it, stones. There's some kind of stone that could be marking a grave, I don't know, in the middle, and then on the edge there's a little arrangement of stones, so it must have been used, I'm guessing, for some sort of ceremonial process. And then these doorways in the hillside of Kennan Hill, maybe leading into the ancestors. Feels like a very powerful place. So I'm going to sit and dream here for a bit. I can imagine on a full moon still night this would be incredible, lit up by the moonlight, this little valley, and these stones reflecting the moonlight. It would feel really special here. It does now, and it's daylight, so the silvery light from the sun coming through the cloud, and the stillness, just a very gentle breeze. These are some other places that I visited on Dartmoor associated with pixies. There's Holwell Lawn, which every year is carpeted in bluebells. It's just a stunning place and so enchanting. It's amazing. And it's said that the pixies weave their spells around the bluebells, and therefore you mustn't pick them or walk through them. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't do that anyway. But yeah, so it's amazing, and I've sat and meditated next to the bluebells in this area. I've just had some amazing feelings and insights and experiences, such as tuning in and hearing the fairy bells once, and other experiences like that, which just, yeah, so calming as well. This is the Pixies Church, which it's believed if you put your ear to the stone, you'll hear the bells ringing inside the church. This is the Pixies Gardens, which is near South Seal. It's a series of small private fields, but there's a footpath that goes through and takes you up onto Cosden Hill. So it's one of these local secrets that I discovered last year, and it's amazing. Very, very beautiful place. There's Pixie Glen at Lidford Gorge, another beautiful place owned by the National Trust. And this little Clapper Bridge, there's a story about an old woman that's crossing this Clapper Bridge, and she encountered a pixie and decided spontaneously to scoop him up and put her in her basket so she'd take him home. I don't know what she planned to do with him, but he escaped because pixies can get through really small cracks. And so he escaped through the weave in her basket. Another walk I did was from Dunstone to Windsor, following the path of Nanny Norrish, which is a story collected by William Crossing. And I did this walk on near to winter solstice in 2021. So you can see this washerwoman here. Nanny Norrish was a washerwoman. She made her living by going to all the farms in the area around Widdicombe within walking distance, and she would do the laundry for those farms and then walk back across the moor to her home in Dunstone. At Dunstone, there's the Dunstone itself, which has lots of pits in it, and people would leave libations in it for the spirits of place. So that would have included the pixies, I suspect. And there's me on Wintour and me walking along the lane on the way to Wintour. So one of the locals asked Nanny whether she was afraid of the pixies crossing the moor. She did regularly, and she said, no, those pixies, they don't scare me. So the pixies overheard her and they took offence and they decided to play a trick on her. When she was crossing the moor one evening on her way home, they made a pyramid. They formed a pyramid in front of her of pixies, which terrified her, as it would. And then she became lost. So she'd walked across the moor many, many times, but she was pixie-led and she didn't get home till after dark, totally terrified and disorientated. And she never spoke against the pixies again. This is Hut Holes, which is near Dockwell Farmhouse, one of the farmhouses that Nanny was supposedly did the laundry for. And it's a medieval village. It's very pretty. It's worth a visit if ever you're over that way. And I noticed this gatepost with a lovely mossy top to it that looked like a face to me. This is my dad near the waterfall at a place called Jordan, which is just a bit further on from Dockwell. And then we returned back to Widdicombe by taking these lovely old steps and footpath across the field back to Wintour and then back towards Widdicombe. It's a lovely walk. So I'm just going to talk about mystical woodland and then move on to pixie experiences. So there's a few mystical woodlands on Dartmoor. There's 3 that have these truncated oaks in them, small twisty oaks, and that's Wistman's Wood, which is the most well known, but also protected. So they're discouraging, Dartmoor Park Authority are discouraging people from trudging through it now because during lockdown it was so frequented by people and leaving their rubbish behind or taking the very ancient moss off the trees and lichens off the trees. So unfortunately, it's a case of a minority of people who have kind of spoilt things for the rest of us who are respectful and go there to just enjoy and respect nature and leave no trace. Sad, because it's one of my favourite places to go, and I know some quiet places there where I can just go and sit and escape the visitors. This is a pixie stool where pixies were believed to stand and keep lookout in woodlands whilst the rest of them were dancing. There'd be one pixie that would act like a meerkat and look out for anyone that was coming along. And if you came across pixies dancing, then it's more than likely that they would mislead you and you'd be lost in the woods. This is my painting of Malachite, the pixie, who I'm going to talk about next when I talk about my pixie experiences. Okay, some historical pixie sightings. There's a few of these, a few of them in folklore, a few of them on other records. The farm buildings, the top left. This is a place that I went to last summer, so 2022, called Laughter Hole Farm. And there's a story that William Crossing recorded about a farmer called Hannaford and his wife. And the locals believed that they were looking after a troop of pixie children. One of Crossing's contemporaries, who was a Dartmoor local, said that this story, which had been written about 100 years before Crossing had written it down, which had been the people involved that supposedly lived at the farm about 100 years before Crossing had written this story down, so towards the end of the 18th century, and he was writing around the end of the 19th century. There was an actual Samuel Hannaford that lived there. I've traced him. There's quite a few Hannafords on Dartmoor, but there was a Hannaford, Samuel Hannaford, that lived there at Laughter Hole Farm. And so this friend of Crossing said that this story was based upon the idea that every time visitors went to visit the farm, the children would hide, that they were shy, so they would hide behind the rocks and behind the trees and run away. And he said that's where the idea that there were pixies came from. However, who knows, because this is an area that is absolutely surrounded by stories of pixies, especially in nearby Postbridge, Ridden Ridge, which is not very far from Laughter Hole, is associated with pixies as well. In the early 20th century or mid 20th century, the folklorist Theo Brown wrote a wonderful paper called Tales of a Dartmoor Village, which is all about Postbridge and the customs and folklore of that area. And she said that the locals there believed that one of the best places to see pixies was Ridden Ridge, that people had seen pixies in the area, and her own mother had seen pixies at a place called Drift Lane, which is this little lane here. It goes along the back of the visitor centre, and her mother said that she saw a green figure along that lane. This is Ridden Ridge, really mysterious place near the river, near Belliver, near the River Dart. And this is Haytor, so 1950s, a woman and who was there with her son she had a sighting of a pixie disappearing into the rocks at Haytor. I always think these rocks look like giant's toes, 6 toes of a giant. Those are modern day sightings. In 2016, I went to Heathercombe Gardens with my mum, and we were walking along through the gardens. We'd just been looking around. We were heading back to the cafe for a cup of tea. We'd just been having a laugh and a joke because my mum had taken a very unflattering photo of me, which we were having a giggle about, and we were going past this huge log which was on our left, and we were walking along the path to the right of it. At the corner of my eye, I saw a little figure sat on the end of the log, and I immediately said to my mum, "Oh, look, there's a pixie." And my mum said, "Oh yes, a pixie," straight away. This all happened in a few split seconds. And then we walked on, and I said, "Yeah, I saw a pixie on the end of the log." She said, "Yeah." And so in that moment, we'd both had very similar experience. And my mum she's got very different mindset to me. I wholeheartedly believe in fairies, supernatural beings. My mum doesn't. But for some reason in that moment, I think we'd connected to our childlike selves through this light-heartedness we were having together. And something opened up in both of us, and we both had the same, it's a very precious experience, the same experience. I've since spoken to my mum, but because she's quite poorly at the moment, she doesn't really remember that experience, but I hold that as a very precious experience. Another experience I had shared with another person was an experience I had at Tunhill Rocks on Dartmoor with my children. And we'd been up there, first time I'd been there, we walked up there for the afternoon. It's near Widdicombe. Before we left, I was drawn to walk across to another rock, and my children just wanted to they just wanted to go home, but I said, "Oh, I've got to go to that rock." So we walked across to the rock, and we were stood there looking out down towards Widdicombe, which is quite a way away in the distance. And it's just open landscape, as you can see in this picture, surrounded by ferns, rocks, a few sheep. And my son turned to me, he said, "Can you hear that?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "I can hear music." And I listened. I said, "Oh, it's kind of like fluty sort of music." He said, "Yes." So we could both hear this fluty sort of music. Couldn't identify the source. I mean, it's not to say that there could have been somebody a few hundred yards away sat in amongst the ferns playing a flute. Who knows? But excuse me, but it's not something, couldn't see anyone wandering around with a flute. As I said, there might have been somebody there that we couldn't see, but it's very distinct. And yeah, very special shared experience. I feel it could have been something supernatural, but I might be wrong. But very unusual. It's not the first time I've heard, as I said, beginning, I've heard what I call fairy music on a few occasions. I've heard singing in a couple of places. So on Bodmin Moor a few years ago, I was staying at a friend's house in St Clear. This was about, 25 years or so ago. Um, and it was in the middle of the night, and I could hear a choir of people singing, and it was coming from Bodmin Moor. I mean, St Clear is just like a little village on the edge of Bodmin Moor. It was just dead of night, deadly quiet, apart from the singing in the distance. So, yeah, there's been experiences like that. I just can't explain. This is one of my paintings. Oh, I'll explain the bouquets as well. I met with a man for my podcast a few months ago who had loads of stories about Dartmoor. He spent a lot of time on Dartmoor over the years. And he said early one morning, he'd been wild camping early one morning. He was walking across the moor, quite a remote area of the moor, and he came across all of these little bouquets of flowers lying on the ground. And he said they were all done up with little ribbons, just tiny bouquets. I mean, unless somebody had been doing a ceremony there, I don't know. Very unusual. And he'd seen tiny little flowers in other remote places on the moor that are around fairy toadstools, the Amanita muscara toadstools. He found a patch of those, and around those were scattered all these little tiny flowers that he'd never seen before. So who knows? Another pixie experience I had. This was the first pixie experience, unless the fairy that I saw at university, unless that was a pixie, could have been. I mean, it's all the same. I don't know. Some people call them elves. If you get into, all different fairy types, but anyway, I identified this as a pixie sighting. So in 2016, I'd been doing a fairy course. I'd not connected with the fairies for a few years. I'd had on-off contact with them. And then in 2016, I did this little fairy course, and I thought, right, this is the path I'm just going to keep following now, because they keep coming back into my life. And for some reason, I need to follow this path. I created a journal because the course suggested to keep a journal of fairy experiences. So I made a journal, and I decided to go up to Wistman's Wood, and this was in June 2016. When I arrived, I parked up and I was walking. As I got nearer to the wood, I could hear giggling. This is something else associated with pixies, another sound that's associated with the presence of fairies. And I kept walking, kept hearing the giggling, got to the front of the wood, and was told intuitively to keep walking. And they said, there's something special for you. Keep walking to the end of the wood. So I kept walking around the edge of the wood. Anytime I paused, I was encouraged by this inner voice to tell me to keep moving on. Then I arrived at this stone, which I didn't know at the time is known as the Druid Stone or the Buller Stone. It's called the Buller Stone because there's an inscription on it by a botanist, I think he was, dedicated to this botanist called Buller. Anyway, it's also called the Druid Stone, and there's not much known about it, but to me, it's obviously associated with the ancient landscape and the Bronze Age or Neolithic remains that are around the area. To me, it looked like a little gateway. I asked permission to go into the woods, and I was told first initiation, those were the words. And I instantly knew that I had to do something for them, for the fairies, before I go into the wood. And something I've been called to do for weeks was to clear rubbish, trash from my local woodland in Bradley Woods, where I live now. And I hadn't done it. And I'd brought with me a black rubbish sack. So I thought, okay, where's the trash? And I looked over, and behind the Druid stone, I could see some rubbish that needed clearing. So I did that. And then I asked again, can I come into the wood? I poured some water on the ground as an offering. And I was told, yes, you can come in. I took some photos before I went into the wood, did some drawing, did some sketching, made some notes, spotted a tree spirit while I was in there. Just literally could see these bright yellow eyes, or bright green eyes rather, like staring at me from this tree. It's an amazing place. When I got home, I was looking through my photos. I really enjoy looking through my photos after I've been out in nature and just seeing if I can spot anything. And I shared one of my photos in a fairy group I belonged to at the time. And somebody said, oh, there's a little figure in the tree above the stone. And I looked and I thought, oh my goodness. So I've circled where it was, this little figure that's above the stone. Now I can see it very clearly, but I must admit that I'm very tuned in to seeing this imagery. So don't worry if you can't see it very clearly, but in my heart, I felt this is a pixie. So there he is. And I did an illustration of him here. I didn't know his name at the time, but there he is. He looks like he's pointing to where I found this rubbish that I cleared. There's a close-up of the stone. So after that, I built a connection with this pixie, and I was on the way, driving across Dartmoor to Tavistock a few months later, and I heard coming from the direction of where this wood is, malachite, because I was going to a crystal shop in Tavistock. And I had a really lovely chat to the woman in Tavistock. I bought a couple of pieces of malachite crystal. She was very kind. She gave me a couple of crystals as well. We had a lovely chat. And then I brought these 2 pieces of malachite home. And shortly after that, in early 2017, a few months later, my son and I decided to go to Wistman's Wood. And my son was about 11 then. And we went early one morning, and my mum wasn't very well at the time. She'd recently been diagnosed with cancer. She's still going strong. She's been having treatment, but yeah, she was very poorly, and I'd been looking after her. So this was a real joy to be able to go to Wistman's Wood and be in this beautiful place. Yeah, so and we took the crystal and had a lovely time there together. Took some photos, and Ethan put one of the crystals into one of the old trees, a hole in the tree, and we got home, and I don't know how much longer it was. A few days later, we were looking at the photos, and he said, oh, that tree looks like a face. And where the hole was, it looked like an eye. So it looked like a pixie's face, the tree. It's almost like he put the malachite into the pixie's eye. It was really amazing. And then my next experience with pixies was this was after Wistman's Wood, so this was maybe later in June, July time in 2016. I went to Bideford with my mum for a weekend to go to a fairy fair and ball, and we booked up to stay in this lovely old cottage, B&B. And up behind the cottages, you can see it had this very steep garden. So the picture on the left here, this is the top of the garden. You can just see the roof of the cottage. It was amazing. It's so steep, it just climbed up and up and up. And it was full of wild flowers that came right up to the windows of the cottage. Oh, sorry, this is the cottage here. So as you can see, all the flowers are level with the top windows. It's just beautiful to stay in. And I really sensed there was a fairy presence there. So the first morning we were there, I was in bed and I was meditating, and I connected with this pixie that said he was the guardian of the garden, and he looked a bit like a hedgehog. So he was a cross between like a humanoid and it had a very hedgehoggy face with the little bright eyes, dark eyes. And he was showing me that he could shapeshift form. I called him Fizzwig. And then I later found out that the old Devon word for hedgehog is fuzzy pig. Or fuzz pig. So yeah, I've done some drawings of him as well that I haven't got on this presentation, but I will share those in my book that I'm writing about pixies.
The spirits of place have their own ways of talking about places and addressing them or naming them. My conclusion about pixies is that they're often heard singing and making music and dancing. So this is obviously a very important pastime for them. As mentioned in all of their folklore, they enjoy singing and dancing, frolicking. Not many of them are named in stories, and they seem to be a bit shy or reticent about names or giving a name. And I think they'd be the same about places. I think that they know a place by its music, by its vibration, what dowsers call the energetic signature of the place, which all places have. I believe pixies have musical associations and sounds with places, and that's maybe why people hear them singing in a place, because they are responding to the music of that place. So it might be a song, whereas humans have always been concerned about possessing places by naming them after themselves or after landscape features, but mainly many places are named after an ancient landowner. On Dartmoor, a few places are named after landscape features that the names sum up the topographical makeup, I suppose, or topographical signature of the place. I'm passionate about these places, finding these pixie place bagging. My writings is more on the romantic side than the rationalist side about the landscape, but also I want you, dear reader, to feel the love affair that I have with Dartmoor. This has been a quest, an odyssey of mine since about April 2021, of finding the Pixie places of Dartmoor. Maybe a little bit before that actually, early 2020. And then actually deciding that that was it, I was going to find these places and go to as many as possible whilst I was writing my book, so that I could convey what they were like. Well, most of them actually have been really, really interesting. Thank you for watching. If you want to connect with me more, you can go to my website where you'll find more information about me and what I do. Thank you for listening, and I hope you've enjoyed.